This week on Destination Earth X, we ask the question, who was the best Superman?
Hello, Clark. Can't say I love what you've done with the place.
What?
You still say it the same way. Astonishment, mixed with a hint of dread, yet with a hopeful finish.
You're alive.
It seems my father had a change of heart. And I got a second chance at life.
Where's Tess? What have you done with her?
She's fine. I wouldn't worry so much about my dear little sister. You know, I used to think it was our families that made us who we are. Then I hoped it was our friends. But if you look at history, the great men and women of the world have always been defined by their enemies.
You have a second chance. You can change all that.
But that's the thing about memories. You can't forget them. Like how you were always that one step ahead of me, Clark. No matter how meticulously I prepared, no matter how strategic I was. If only I'd known I never stood a chance.
It wasn't a competition.
Of course it wasn't. You were born to be the chosen one. You're simply better than us.
And that always killed you.
No. No, what killed me is that you didn't even want it. You fought it, you hid from it. I would have taken it and relished it, embraced it.
My destiny wasn't yours to take.
I get that now. Which is why I finally embraced my own. You and I, we will both be great men. Because of each other. We have a destiny together, Clark. Only on different sides.
And I'll always be there to stop you. Always.
Oh, I'm counting on it. Our story hasn't been written yet, Kal-El. And every villain is only as great as his hero. You see, that all relies on you saving us from the coming apocalypse.
You know about Darkseid?
You really think I just read the cliff notes of the Veritas journals? They foretold of a chosen savior. The light that will inspire this world out of darkness. You're the light, Clark. Only you hold the power within you.
I'm not so sure that Clark Kent can save the entire world on his own.
He can. But we both know who can.
I'm sorry I couldn't save you, Lex.
Welcome to Destination Earth X. I am your host, Silky Dave Brown. This week we tackle the subject of Superman. I'm not going to lie, this is something I wanted to talk about for a long time. And this past Friday on Collider Heroes, which you can watch on the Collider Video YouTube channel, it's hosted by John Schnepp, they did an episode discussing who was the best Superman, giving their opinions. And it just got me thinking about the subject again. I decided, you know what, let's go ahead and do this now while I'm thinking about it. Of course, as with all Destination Earth X episodes, spoilers ahead, be forewarned. So with Superman, you have obviously the original superhero, the most iconic character in all of comic books, one of the most iconic characters in American history. And people often, say Superman's this Boy Scout, he's boring, blah, blah, blah. Superman either works really, really well or he doesn't. And we've had some really great on-screen iterations of the character. And I'm going to give you my 3 favorites and also my favorite comic book iteration. So, starting with Superman, the things to me, what makes Superman work? Why is Superman a great character? Is it because he's, invulnerable? He's got super strength. He can fly. He's super fast. He's got a chiseled face. All that stuff. To me, that's not what it is. What makes Superman great is the fact that he is inspiring. And he's not just inspiring because he can do these great feats. Superman is inspiring because he's such a great person. To me, Superman works best when you see him being an amazing person and a great person, and it makes you want to be a better person. My favorite Superman stories, my favorite Superman moments on film are the ones where you watch the character and you just feel, or I feel like, I want to be a better person because this guy is so good. He makes me want to be a better person. And honestly, that's the way I felt about Wonder Woman in the movie, which we will be doing a review of very soon, quite possibly next week. In fact, now that I've said it, I will make next week the Wonder Woman review episode because that's coming out soon on digital and DVD. But back to Superman, what makes this character work is you watch him, you read him, and he makes you want to be a better person. Just because he's so good. Now, why? Why does Superman do what he does? Well, the simple answer is because he can. His motivation in so many ways is completely pure. He's not angry. He is not seeking revenge for a killed parent. He is not driven by guilt because he hadn't done something and then realizes that he has this responsibility. No, he is driven purely because, hey, I have these abilities. I want to help people. That is living your life in service of others to a T. That is the lessons of all of the great teachers, all of the great spiritual teachers. And yeah, sometimes I'm going to talk about this a bit reverently because, Superman to me is an amazing character. He's probably my favorite comic book character. He's probably my favorite superhero. For a long time when I was a kid, my favorites were either Green Lantern, Hal Jordan, or Captain Marvel, aka now Shazam. But as I got back into comics as an adult, and I read more, and I read more Superman stories, I realized that Superman is really the character that I love and that speaks most to me. And the thing with it, there's so many different versions of him, and you think back to, say, in The Dark Knight Returns, Frank Miller's interpretation of Superman. Frank Miller did a lot of amazing things in Dark Knight Returns, and I think he completely misunderstood Superman. Now, could that have something to do with his philosophy? It's very Ayn Randian, which I'm not a fan of, not to get political. But there's a great video on YouTube that explains how The Dark Knight Returns is, or it gives an interpretation of The Dark Knight Returns as this Ayn Randian story. It's fascinating. You should go check it out. I forget who did it, and so I apologize for not giving credit where credit is due. But it's fascinating to look at it through those lenses. It doesn't take anything away from the story. It's still an amazing story. And Frank Miller really always did nail Batman. You think about the great Frank Miller written Batman tales. You got Dark Knight Returns, Batman Earth 1, All-Star Batman and Robin. All three of these tremendous stories. But I don't think he ever got Superman because I don't think he gets Superman. I really don't. From his philosophy, from his point of view, a character like Superman doesn't make sense. Because if you think about it, someone who believes in objectivism, which is the philosophy that Ayn Rand believed in and preached. And for those of you who might not know who Ayn Rand is, she wrote the book Atlas Shrugged. She was from Russia. She was a political commentator back in the 60s and 70s, very outspoken against Russia, very outspoken against communism, all good things, but a firm believer in this thing called objectivism. A lot of modern day libertarians and super fiscal conservatives follow her point of view. But objectivism essentially, at its core, as I understand it, says greed is good, and you should do things for yourself and your family first. Fuck everyone else. To me, I think that's pretty screwed up. I think you should always put other people first, and live your life in service of others. And I look at Superman, and Superman's a character that does this. You don't see Superman being greedy, or when you do, it's really something is wrong. You think about in Superman 3, I think it is, where he gets kind of ripped apart, and he becomes the dark side of himself, and it's really messed up. You think about the episodes of Smallville where Clark is affected by the red kryptonite, and he is this dark, it's all his darkest, basest instincts, and it's awful. It's just horrible. And you look at that, and you realize that that's not Superman. And that's because we see Superman as this caring, compassionate, giving, selfless person. And so when he's not being like that, when he's acting in a lot of ways like everyone else, people are like, oh, what the hell? And it's awful. So you think about the Frank Miller version of Superman, and it's just wrong. He doesn't get it. But he's looking at it from a certain point of view. He doesn't get the character, I think. As obviously, I don't know the man. I can't speak for him. This is based off of what he's written specifically in Dark Knight Returns, and interviews and things that I've heard. Then there are some people that truly get Superman. I think Richard Donner truly got Superman. I think Jeff Johns gets Superman. I think oh my god, I can't pronounce his name. I'm going to look it up real quick, because there's a great series of graphic novels, short graphic novels that DC has put out called Earth One, and the Superman one is excellent by and yeah, I'm so sorry, sir. It's J. Michael Straczynski. I feel so bad. And this guy, his writing credits are just off the charts, man. In comics, some of my favorite things he's written, he has done. He did the Earth One series. He did another Superman arc called Grounded, which I think is one of the quintessential great Superman tales. And he is, he gets Superman. So this takes us, full circle. Superman is just a character that really is inspiring, and it's, in some ways, he's hard to get, because if you're not someone who puts other people first, or doesn't, if that's not natural to you, a lot of times you don't see that in the character, and it's hard to get past this Boy Scoutiness, not niche, and really see what the character's all about. Which I understand. I mean, not everyone looks at things from those point of views, and you know what? This is my point of view on the character, so maybe I'm even missing it or seeing it different. You know what I'm saying. Anyway, who are the best Superman? So I've got 3 that I'm going to give, and with the thinking about it from the standpoint, when I look at a great Superman story, I always think, I look at it and I wonder, how inspiring is this character? Does this iteration of the character make me want to be a better person? And my 3 favorites, I think, really do. So number 3 is actually the most recent version of Superman. It's from the show Supergirl. Superman played by Tyler Hoechlin, and he is fantastic. So here's why I think the folks who run Supergirl get Superman. He came in and he didn't overshadow anything. This was a fear that Superman would come on the show and he would steal all the limelight from Supergirl, and he didn't. He was there, he offered assistance, he helped. It was never about him. He was just trying to help. And he never overshadowed. To use a wrestling term, as we do over on the Around the Ring podcast, he put over Supergirl so much. He was in there, and he was a guy. He was like the guy you put in the ring with someone who's coming up new, that you know is going to make this other person look like $1 million. And that's what Tyler Hoechlin's iteration of Superman did. At first, I wasn't too fond of the costume, right? My biggest problem with it was the cape. I don't like the shoulder things on the cape, but whatever. And when I first saw the picture, I was like, well, okay, he looks, he's got the Superman look. He's not all, buff like a lot of times we've seen people in recent years, at least certainly in the comics forever. But then, man, on screen, he was a joy to watch. And that is something I think often modern Superman has missed. The last 2 major Superman films that we've had, Superman-only films being Superman Returns and Man of Steel, while I enjoyed both of them, there really isn't any joy in either one. And that's a point that Robert Meyer Burnett brought up on Collider Heroes this week. And it's a perfectly valid point. It's an excellent point. You need joy in Superman. Yeah, he's battling some crazy shit, but he is also a character filled with hope and joy, and that's something that was missing. And admittedly, on a side note, that's something with Man of Steel and Batman v Superman. And I'll just straight up tell you, I love Henry Cavill's performance as Superman and Clark Kent. I think he was inspired casting, and in fact all of those parts have been cast beautifully well, but when they talk about in that and in the trailers for the upcoming Justice League film, talk about how Superman inspired people, when I rewatch those films, I'm like, did he really? I mean, he saved people, and I think there's a lot from that world that we didn't get to see. And there was a lot of Superman being Superman that we just didn't get. And it would have been really nice to have gotten something in between Man of Steel and Batman v Superman. And I don't hate Batman v Superman. In fact, I think the extended edition is excellent. There are a few, problems here and there. But overall, I think it's a really, really fun movie. And it looks fantastic, visually stunning. So I'm not a hater of those films, but I don't think they quite get what I think you need to get with Superman. They're getting there, and I think they will eventually. I think we're going to see more of this in Justice League, I'm hoping. And my hope is that whenever Man of Steel 2 comes around, which last I heard, it's not Matthew Vaughn. It's I forget the guy's name who has been rumored to direct, but he should be great. And I think if Jeff Johns is helping in the creative process, it's gonna be great, because Jeff Johns gets Superman. So just wanted to get that out of the way, because I do think that in a lot of ways the Henry Cavill performance is they talk about him being inspiring, but I just haven't seen it yet. It's so his death didn't have as much weight, kind of like, in a way, with the new Star Trek movies. By Star Trek Beyond, again, when I mentioned spoilers earlier, the Enterprise is destroyed, and you have all these really emotional moments between Kirk and Spock. But I'm like, have we earned it yet? And I also don't hate those movies. I grew up on Star Trek. I love Star Trek. I like those films. I really, really do. I think their performances are outstanding. But when the Enterprise is destroyed in the films originally, in Search for Spock, it was just heart-wrenching. And when we saw the new Enterprise at the end of Voyage Home, it was this amazing moment. And yeah, when you're watching these reboots, some of it is you should know the past to really get the emotional depth. But otherwise, we didn't have all the years of stories and whatnot built up to really make that hit home. And I don't fault the performances or anything. You just hadn't had enough time to percolate, to get us there. And I think that's been some of the problems so far in the DCEU, is they took some real big jumps with Superman, and I don't think we'd gotten there yet. We hadn't earned it yet, so to speak. And with Superman Returns, I think it is a wonderful ode and tip of the hat to Richard Donner's Superman films. I think Brandon Routh does a tremendous performance doing the Christopher Reeve version of Superman. But he is pretty mopey, and there's not the joy you get from the Christopher Reeve's performance. We'll talk about Christopher Reeves in a moment, but back to Tyler Hoechlin. In Supergirl, he comes in, and he's there, and you could tell the characters around him want to be a better person just because he is such a good person. They nailed it. I can't wait to see him again on Supergirl. I really hope he's in season 3. I think he just nailed it out of the park. I'd be totally up for CW doing a Superman show. I don't think that's going to happen, but it would be incredible. I would tune in every single week. I would be buying the DVDs. It's just game over, man. I'm there. I'm there. So on to number 2. My number 2 favorite Superman is Christopher Reeve. Now, why isn't he number 1? And I'll get to that in a second. But here's what they've done exceptionally well in those movies. Superman the movie came out in 1978, a year after Star Wars, and did amazing things. Technically, yeah, it's got some goofy storytelling stuff and some plot holes, but it is a joy to watch. It is fun, and they get the essence of the character. Clark isn't there for himself. He is there to help other people, and that is what Superman is all about. And sure, it's hokey, but you got to remember that Superman, what Donner was going for, I truly think, is the Superman of the Silver Age, and I think he nailed it. He got the Superman of the Silver Age. Did a beautiful job, and those first 2 movies are incredible. Hell, I like Superman 3. Part of that's because I love Richard Pryor, huge Richard Pryor fan. And if you don't know who Richard Pryor is, he was a comedian. He was very colorful in his language, inspired a couple of generations worth of comedians, and tremendously funny. And yeah, it was a weird fit. Why in the hell are you having this comedian in a Superman movie? I liked it. Of course, it's been a long time since I saw it. I loved it as a kid. I thought it was fun. Superman 4 Quest for Peace is a flaming piece of crap. I know Christopher Reeves had so many great intentions with that film. It was, a social commentary and all of this, but it just really didn't work. But the other thing you got to remember is these films were still came from a time when the source material wasn't revered. It wasn't seen as anything, it wasn't seen as great literature. At that point, you had a couple of books, a few things that were seen as, really, really good. Watchmen, Dark Knight Returns, Marvel had a few things that people could look at and go, this is really good stuff. As I heard once in a documentary, As someone said, this is something you could take to your college professor and not be embarrassed about. And he was talking about Watchmen. But at the point when those films were made, comics were still seen as this joke. I mean, you think about what are some of the other big versions of Superman or superheroes we had in pop culture. You had the 1966 Batman series, Biff Bang Pow, Holy whatever the fuck Batman. You had Super Friends and Aquaman with his and Mary Marvin and what's her name, and then the Wonder Twins, and basically it sounded like the same voice actor for everything. So that's what a lot of people thought of. And then you did have the Incredible Hulk, which had some great acting moments, but then also was you could tell they just didn't want to go all the way with the comic bookiness of it. And that's a problem I think that that the Christopher Reeve Superman films do suffer from, but they are a product of their time, and it is still to this day. Every on-screen iteration of Superman will forever be compared to Superman the movie. It is one of the greatest superhero films ever made. It is one of the greatest films that has come out of the DC canon. And in a future episode, I'm going to rank basically take the DC films, not just the DCEU, but all the films made about DC characters, at least all the ones I've seen, and rank them from best to worst. And Superman the movie is going to be up in probably the top 3. It is that good, and it sure that's hokey, and some people are going to look at it now and go, oh man, these special effects suck, and blah blah blah. And it might be something that if you weren't of the generation that grew up watching it, you don't get it. I understand, but still a tremendous film. And Christopher Reeves, I think, truly got the character. He embodied the service aspect of the character, the pure goodness of the character, and he did that beautifully. And then we have my number 1 pick, which is Tom Welling in Smallville. And yes, technically he was only Superman for a few moments in that show, but as we heard in the clip a moment ago, which was from the Smallville finale, Clark Kent in that show was he was flawed, but he was a person who was just trying to be a great person. He was just trying to be there for other people, take care of his friends and his family, help everyone that he could because he could. And we watching that show, especially as the show went on, it just, to me, he was an inspiring character. You watched it, I watched it, and I thought, this makes me want to be a better person. They get it. And yeah, there were people pissed you never got him in the suit, and some people blame, the showrunners, and apparently at the end, Tom Welling has come out recently, talked about this, where they were going to have a whole scene of him flying around in the suit, and he said, no, that's not what the show is about. And on the one hand, I don't blame the guy, because there is something that happens. As amazing as these performances have been, Christopher Reeve, you going back to George Reeves, you put on that suit and you get typecast. So he's already done this character for 10 years. So you do something that long, you're going to have a hard time finding another acting gig. So on top of that, if he puts on the suit, let's say for 15 minutes of the final episode, he wears the suit. Not only is he typecasted from doing a show for 10 years, he is now Superman. And that never goes away. So I don't blame him from that standpoint, not putting on the suit. Really. We get that awesome final shot at the end, which I love and gives me chills. And in fact, I'm going to do an episode at some point breaking down the series finale of Smallville because I think it's outstanding. But Tom Welling embodied Clark Kent so beautifully that he is, to me, he is my Superman. He is the one that I look at, and you do use Christopher Reeves as the benchmark of how you judge all other Superman performances. I just happen to like Tom Welling's a little bit more, and that's knowing that the bar is Christopher Reeves. But Tom Welling he nailed it, and I know there was a lot of hope that he would be the next Superman. I only saw that working if they did a film that was based in the Smallville world. And there was talk that he would be the person to play Superman in Supergirl. I'm glad they didn't go that route. I would like to see him in Supergirl, maybe as another character. I mean, you think Dean Cain did stuff in... Dean Cain and both Christopher Reeves both appeared in Smallville. Dean Cain has appeared in Supergirl. So there's precedent for this. Another thing I think would be amazing is the Flash, in the Flash TV series and in the Flash film, at some point running through the Speed Force. And we've seen this before when the Flash in the TV shows running through the Speed Force sees these images. And in the show, they showed an image from the 1990 Flash TV series. I really want DC to go the whole nine. Have him running through and him see Christopher Reeve Superman, Michael Keaton's Batman, Smallville, all the other CW shows, the DCEU. I think that would be tremendous, because Smallville is important to this. It's a piece of this puzzle, and that performance is tremendous. And it really is from a point of view. Here's this guy who has these abilities, and he just wants to help people. That's all. Which takes us to one of my favorite comic iterations, probably my favorite, and my real favorite, honestly, origin story of Superman, which was Superman Secret Origins, written by Jeff Johns. This is the reboot of the origin after Infinite Crisis. So after Crisis on Infinite Earths, we had Man of Steel by John Byrne, which depowered Superman. But I also think I need to reread it, for one thing. I don't have it, and I have a hard time finding the graphic novel. I need to get my hands on that. But that iteration of Superman, because I did read between that and Death of Superman, it wasn't about as much Superman being a great person. I think there was some awesome stuff that was in there, but it wasn't about the inspiring part of the character. Then we had, in the 90s, Mark Waid did a retooling of the origin in Superman Birthright, which is tremendous. It took me a while to get into the artwork, and I still had issues with it as his new origin because of timing and certain things with technology and cell phones, and I didn't think the timeline worked, but it was a tremendous story. And then there was, at one point, there was an issue of, I think, Action Comics, and I don't know what the number is. I've tried to find out, but at some point Superman goes through a vortex, and he sees both of his histories, and he has to pick one, and he ends up picking Birthright, and that becomes his origin, and that's the origin that stood. And I think they came out in the 90s, might come out in the early 2000s. That's the one that stood until Infinite Crisis. And Infinite Crisis came out in 2005. It was a sequel to Crisis on Infinite Earths, the famous 1985 reboot of the DC Universe. And after that, because the multiverse came back, and so things were changed. And in fact, they allude to it. Alexander Luthor talks about in the end of the story how Superman did function as Superboy, Wonder Woman was an original member of the Justice League, all of this. And they retold his origin with Superman Secret Origin. They did one with Green Lantern Secret Origin, which then eventually tied into the Sinestro Corps War and Blackest Night, subject for another day. But there's a certain panel in this book that I think really, really gets Superman. It's a specific page. It's in, I want to say it's issue 6. I've actually posted it to my Instagram before, so I'm looking at that right now. To set the stage, Superman has been fighting Metallo, and in the process, the military is there on Metallo's side trying to capture Superman because General Lane, Lois Lane's dad, has an issue with him. He's still very new. People barely know him. They don't understand him. And there's about to be a confrontation between the regular folks and the military because they saw Superman trying to save them from Metallo. He tried to save military guys from Metallo, and there's about to be this fight, and so he stops, and Superman says, "Stop, everyone, please stop before someone gets hurt, seriously hurt." But you helped us, Superman. Who sent you here? Superman: nobody sent me here. I came here. Why? Tell us, Superman. What do you want us to do? I want you to stop looking for a great savior. Lex Luthor isn't it. I'm not. You are. All of you. I do what I do because I was given a gift. But all of you were given gifts too. Use them to make each other's lives better. Show the world that Metropolis has a heart. That's Superman. He does it because he can. Probably better than any other page in comics history that I've personally seen. This gets the character. This gives me chills. I read this and it affects me. I love it. And it's what makes the Man of Steel the Man of Steel. This is what makes Clark Kent such a tremendous character. And this is something I read and I get inspired by. Because he's right. Just to give my own opinion on some things, we shouldn't be looking for great saviors other than in ourselves. Because if we take care of each other, we can make this world a better place. And that is, I think, the message of Superman. And that's the message of this book. And it's a message that we really could all use, especially in these crazy-ass days. So, again, just to recap, my top 3 Men of Steel. At number 3, Tyler Hoechlin from the series Supergirl. Number 2, Christopher Reeves from the 70s and 80s films. And number 1, Tom Welling from Smallville. 3 tremendous performances, by all accounts, 3 great dudes, especially Christopher Reeves. Not enough can be said about the amazing person he was. And that's my favorite Superman, and who I think was the best Superman. Continuing with the Man of Steel theme, this week's suggested readings is all Superman related. Now, these are all just actual Superman stories. We're not talking Final Crisis, not even Final Crisis isn't very good. But we're not talking about things like Kingdom Come. We're just talking about Superman stories. And let's just go ahead and start it off with one of, if not my favorite Superman story, the one I mentioned just a little bit ago, Superman's Secret Origin, written by Jeff Johns, drawn by Gary Frank. This is the retelling of Superman's origin in the post-Infinite Crisis DC universe. It's perfect. It pulls in everything about Superman that is great. All the usual suspects are there. The Legion of Superheroes even makes an appearance. It's excellent. You can't go wrong. Then we've got one from a darker time, Superman Red Sun. This one came out in 2003. It was written by Mark Millar, penciled by Dave Johnson and Killian Plunkett. I believe I pronounced that right. And this is a retelling of the Superman origin, what would have happened had Clark Kent, had baby Kal-El landed in the Soviet Union. And the story mixes alternate reality versions of different characters from history like Joseph Stalin and JFK. Plus you have different versions of Batman in there, and it is just fantastic. It's a really interesting what-if story, and it's worth checking out. It's collected in some great graphic novels, so I highly suggest that one. Going on something more recent, we had Superman Lois and Clark, which you can get in Volume 1. The storyline is titled Arrival, and this is in the New 52 universe. We have the pre-New 52 Superman and Lois Lane appearing with their son Jonathan, and originally everyone thought, or kind of assumed, that this was because of the Convergence storyline, in which Superman and his wife were... Okay, just read Convergence. Anyway, But as it turns out, you go to Superman Reborn, and it might not be that way. It's a great precursor to what has happened in Rebirth. So I highly suggest checking that out. And speaking of which, then you go to Superman Reborn, which was a series in both the Superman and Action Comics titles that came out just this year, dealing with Superman and the two iterations, the New 52 Superman and the pre-New 52 Superman, who had come back during the Rebirth event. And so here's the thing. Okay, New 52 Superman. DC did a lot of neat things with the New 52, most notably Aquaman. The Aquaman stuff was fantastic. The Court of Owls, City of Owls, basically everything Scott Snyder did with Batman was excellent. Wonder Woman had some good stuff, but they really, really messed up a couple of characters. The worst, I think, the most egregious sin was what happened with Oliver Queen, aka Green Arrow, but also Superman was not right. He was kind of a dick, and by the end of it, it started to get back to his hopeful, inspiring nature, but it didn't work for the longest time. And when I read Convergence, again, it's a crossover event that happened, and it's quite fun. I thoroughly enjoyed it because here was the pre-Flashpoint, pre-New 52 Superman that's my Superman that I know and love, and I ate it up. So yeah, Superman Reborn was a fascinating storyline, and how they're weaving back in the pre-New 52 continuity into the New 52 continuity, and this stuff continued in the Button, and it's really interesting stuff. So if you're someone like me who just loves the ins and outs of the DC multiverse and how that works, you will love this. Then we've got Superman Earth 1. It's so far they've released 3 volumes, all written by J. Michael Straczynski, illustrated by Shane Davis. These are pretty small little graphic novels, and they're excellent. There's an Earth 1 series that DC is doing that is really, really good, but the Earth 1 Superman stories are just a fun retelling, and really, in a lot of ways, Man of Steel owes a lot to the Earth 1 series. There was a lot of the plot of Superman Earth 1's Volume 1 and 2. I thought that was used for Man of Steel. Now, I'm not sure, how much that is the case. I'm not sure how much the dates line up, but Volume 1 did come out in 2010, and it's really, really good. And it was the launch of the new Earth 1 series, which so far we've had Superman Earth 1, we've had Batman Earth 1, which they've released 2 volumes so far, both by Jeff Johns. A third one is on the way. Teen Titans Earth 1, written by Jeff Lemire, and they've had 2 volumes of that have come out. There was a Wonder Woman Earth 1 written by Grant Morrison. Volume 2 is apparently on the way. That Wonder Woman came out last year. It's kind of a mess, but we'll talk about that some other time. In the pipe, we've got a Green Lantern Earth 1, Aquaman Earth 1, and the Flash Earth 1. So it's and Straczynski is going to do the Flash, so that should be pretty awesome. Then we've got Superman Grounded. Speaking of J. Michael Straczynski, now a lot of people had issues with this. The basis of the storyline is it's following a storyline called New Krypton, and basically a lot of shit hit the fan, and Superman decides to walk the earth like Kane in Kung Fu. He literally decides he's going to get back in touch with people and walk, and he walks across the country, and it is a just wonderful story. I enjoy this. I know it's pretty people are pretty divided on it, but this is really worth reading, I think, and is a lot of fun. It's a fascinating take on Superman, and it really brings him back down to earth. Then we have what is considered, I think, by many one of the greatest Superman stories ever told, All-Star Superman, written by Grant Morrison, drawn by Frank Quietly. Admittedly, this is one I've read bits and pieces of. There is a animated film that is fantastic that's based on this. That is a very, very truthful interpretation. And this is just one that's always on my list of things to read, and it's huge. So I just haven't gotten around to getting through all of it yet. But from what little I have read, I know it's outstanding. And Grant Morrison's a weird dude, and he is an excellent writer, but sometimes his stuff is really heady and trippy and hard to follow. It's not the case with this. This is a tremendous story. Then we have, so we're going to do a couple of old school ones as well, just to show that I'm not just someone who likes the newer stuff. These next two are both written by Alan Moore. The first is For the Man Who Has Everything, which appeared in Superman Annual number 11, which came out in 1985. It was written by Alan Moore, and the art was done by Dave Gibbons, so the same pair that gave us Watchmen. And this was a story with Mongrel and the, what's it called? The black, oh God, what is that thing called? Black Mercy. There, I found it. And it puts you into a coma, it puts you into your mind into a world of what you always dreamed of. And this is a legendary story. It has been redone in so many different medias, different interpretations of this. It was done as an animated episode of Justice League Unlimited. The Supergirl TV series did a version of this. It's awesome. So you can't. Yeah, this is a must with Superman stories. Speaking of Superman by Alan Moore, there is Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow. So this is the final story of the original Earth 1 Superman. So in 1985, DC rebooted their universe with Crisis on Infinite Earths, and the remaining single Earth was a mixture of 5 different Earths, and the Superman who stood tall was the Superman of Earth 1. But as continuity solidified, he changed, and it basically evolved with his new world, like everyone else did. Alan Moore was asked to write the final tale of the original Superman, or at least of the Silver Age Superman, and it is a fun story. And at the end, there's a nice little reveal that Clark Kent is still alive, and he and Lois have a baby. And it's just a wonderful, wonderful little 2-issue series. It appeared in Superman number 423 and Action Comics 583, and it came out in 1986. And it's just too much fun. It is. If you like any of those older stories, this is one to read. And it's certainly one to read before you pick up the next storyline, which was The Man of Steel, the series written by John Byrne and also drawn by John Byrne, which was the reboot of Superman, came out in 1986. And it's cool. I mean, there's some stuff. They did some really good stuff in here. They limited Superman's powers. He was not, godlike anymore. They made Lex Luthor a businessman instead of a scientist. And a lot of that stuff eventually was redone. Also, he didn't do anything as Superboy. But it is a great story. It's a fascinating look. It's very 1986. Very 1986. Then a number of years, about a couple decades later, there was the Superman Birthright, which I also talked about before, which is another great retelling of his origin. I liked Birthright. I just thought that it well, let's talk about Birthright. Since we talked about Secret Origin, let's go ahead and just finish up the all of the different origins of Superman in the last 30 years. Birthright was a 12-issue series that came out in 2003 and 2004 by Mark Waid, drawn by a gentleman's name I'm not going to butcher. I apologize. This was a more modern retelling of the origin. It eventually became the origin of Superman, and it is really well done. At first, when I read it, I could not get into it because I was really holding on to Man of Steel, because at the time I really liked the Man of Steel origin. They brought back a lot of elements from, the Silver Age and whatnot, and on its own, as a standalone story, it is excellent, and it's definitely one to watch to read in the Superman mythos and mythology, and getting to know the character. I thought it tinkered with the timeline a little, but it's a nice companion to Man of Steel. And it's not the first time that after Crisis on Infinite Earths, origins were redone. And some of this had to do with, events like Zero Hour and all that. Shazam, Captain Marvel's origin, was redone twice. I think, no, it was just redone once after Crisis on Infinite Earths. So, but it's definitely worth reading. And then we've got two more I want to mention. Superman and the Legion of Superheroes. This was another Jeff Johns run, and this was part of kind of almost a trilogy of storylines reintroducing the pre-Crisis on Infinite Earths Legion of Superheroes. It started in the Lightning Saga storyline with the Justice League of America and Justice Society of America, written by Brad Meltzer and Jeff Johns, which is tremendous. And then it's finished in Final Crisis Legion of Three Worlds, which actually has the original Legion of Superheroes, the 1994 version of Legion of Superheroes, and the 2004 version of Legion of Superheroes. And it's great. And at some point I'm going to do an episode about Final Crisis, because I've read Final Crisis 3 times, I think, and that thing's a hot mess. I really, truly don't know what's going on. But this Legion of Three Worlds is tremendous. And in order to understand that, you really do need to read Superman, the Legion of Superheroes. And it's just a fun science fiction superhero story. And then, of course, there's the Big Mamma Jamma, The Death of Superman. Came out in 1992, and it is a story arc that is the full-blown story arc is the death and return of Superman. It's this beast Doomsday comes in, beats the holy hell out of Superman. They basically fight each other to the end. He dies. There is a world without Superman. And they actually did a good job of keeping Superman, gone for a while. So what's even better, though, than the storyline is the story of how this came about. So every year back in the day, and this was written by a number of people, but the main ones were Dan Jurgens, Louise Simonson, and Roger Stern. Jerry Ordway also did writing, Carl Kessel, William Mensner Loebs, and Gerard Jones. So, yes, I'm reading this off of Wikipedia, and yes, I'm butchering their names. I apologize. But all these writers, these guys and gals, would get together every year and plot out the year in Superman stories. And they plotted out the story of Superman and Lois Lane getting married. Well, then they got word that the television series Superman, Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman, was planning on having the characters get married, and they were asked not to do this until closer to the time when that was going to happen on the show, so they could cross-promote. And it was just, there was chaos, and so they had to throw out an entire year's worth of work. And in this meeting, Jerry Ordway said, well, why don't we just kill him? And And this is something that he suggested over the years often. But this time, people said, okay, let's do it. And they wanted to examine a world without Superman. And there's a lot of talk of the storyline in some different documentaries. One, the Secret Origin of the DC Universe documentary that came out in 2011, I think. They spent some time with this, and it's really, really good. There was another documentary about it called Look Up in the Sky, The Amazing Story of Superman. No, I'm sorry. That is just a documentary about Superman, and they talk about this in there. This is it's a good storyline. It's not fantastic. They created Doomsday. He had never been around before. But it did have an effect. I mean, people lined up to buy this. No one gave a fuck about Superman before this. I mean, Superman was going through some dark times. Not as much of a character being dark and broody and, a Zack Snyder, Batman-y kind of way. Just that no one was really reading his books. At the time in the early 90s, most comics had moved up to $1, $1.25. Superman books were still selling for 75 cents in the late 80s, early 90s. And I actually was reading Superman at the time. I enjoyed it. There were, I think, 3 different titles. But you had to buy all 3 because the storyline would go from Action Comics to Superman to the Adventures of Superman. That's how the storylines would go through all 3 books. But this was a huge event because, in comics, people are killed off and come back all the time. And there have been a few there's been really, in major comics storylines, there's been one major death that's stuck. And that's Captain Marvel over in Marvel. And that, Marvel, the original Captain Marvel that they had. The Barry Allen death in Crisis on Infinite Earths lasted for over 20 years. And then the Superman death didn't last as long, but had a gigantic impact. So those are the storylines and books I suggest picking up for your Superman reading. There is literally 75 plus years of stories out there to check out. And also go back and read some of those original, Siegel and Schuster stuff, the Golden Age stuff. It's entertaining in and of itself. So yeah, that is suggested reading for this week, Superman. All right, well, that's going to do it for this week of Destination Earth X. Thank you for joining us. Don't forget to follow the show on Twitter at Target Earth X. We will be back next time. Take care, guys.
Hey, Jim! Whoa!
Excuse me.
That's a bad outfit! Whoa!